Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. Polaris Live is in its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global viewership for your support and confidence in our unbiased global coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. My guest today on PolarisLive.com is Dr. Margaret McQuaig-Johnston. She is a senior fellow, the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, University of Ottawa, and the China Institute, University of Alberta. Ms. McQuaig-Johnston has had a 37-year government career in Canada. She served as the Assistant Deputy Minister at Canada's Department of Finance, Natural Resources Canada, and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and has had senior management positions in Industry Canada, the Prime Minister's National Advisory Board on Science and Technology, the Ministry of State for Science and Technology, Peer Council. Last 7 years of her government career, Margaret was a member of the Canada-China Joint Committee on Science and Technology, close relations with China. She's been there numerous times. Please welcome Margaret McQuaig-Johnston. Good morning, Margaret. How are you?
Fine, thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks for taking time to come. I know you're busy. You're always busy. You're working on a chapter of a book that will come out later in the year, so really appreciate your coming and joining us. I wanted to start by asking you about how you would describe the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, especially around China.
Well, in fact, in Canada, we like to talk about our American cousins because in many ways we are family. And I'm actually quite typical because I'm American as well as Canadian. And I have lots of American cousins. And we are close in cultures and close in political leanings, as well as fully integrated economies. And this is really, I think, an important feature of the relationship. The U.S. is Canada's biggest trading partner. We export more than 73% of our products to the U.S. So it's a big relationship for us, our most important relationship.
How do you, Margaret, if I may ask you, recently, over the last year or so, the two countries have had some really rocky times, especially when the two Michaels, the Canadians who were, shall I say, taken hostage or prisoner by China because of the chief financial officer of Huawei, who was arrested by Canada at the request of the United States. That caused really some bitterness on all three sides, China, U.S., Canada. What do you think was the biggest reason that Canada and the U.S. came out as good, if not better friends at the end of that affair as they were at the beginning? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I feel this issue very personally because I was in Shanghai when the Michaels were detained. And I mentioned this to a Chinese executive with whom I was meeting, and he said, oh, yes, China has a list of 100 Canadians they can pick up and interrogate at any time. And when I got back to Canada, two other people told me about this list. So the Michaels were, I think, at the top of the list with valuable information that could get access to if it detained and interrogated them. They were held almost 3 years. And really, China, I think, was trying to drive a wedge between Canada and the U.S. And as you say, it worked out the opposite way. There was much closer collaboration between Canada and the U.S. government on how to extricate our citizens, ways in which we could work together on the Hmong extradition to the U.S. I think there were some business executives in Canada who wanted our government to just let them go, let Madam Hmong go, and get things back to business as usual. And that didn't happen. The Trudeau government deserves credit for sticking with the rule of law and having her go through the full legal process till a resolution right at the very end. And then we got our Michaels back. Our Michaels and Madam Hmong were exchanged, and their planes passed over the Pacific. And this was a decision that Xi Jinping himself took to send them back at exactly the same time that she was returning to China. And the reason was he wanted to send a message to every other country in the world that if you are offside or if you do something that we don't like, we will arbitrarily detain your citizens. And this has happened to other countries, Australia, South Korea, certainly Taiwan. And so, we were living this for almost 3 years, but it made the U.S. government and the Canadian government even faster friends.
That's so interesting how you put it. Now, here's a question which may be difficult to answer, which is, what do you think is the lesson that China took away from this, Margaret, besides the fact that that Canada and the United States have this relationship which you've been describing? What other major lesson do you think China, if any, took away from that?
Well, certainly they've, built in arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations with a number of countries. And I think they will not be deterred from that. What may have surprised them is that Canada, as a middle power, stood up to them. And they didn't like that at all. I was party to some discussions between the two countries during this period, and they were constantly giving messages like, Canada is not a middle power, it's a small power, it has to stop leaning towards the U.S. And no matter why you arrested Madam Hmong, you did it and you have to be punished. So these were pretty harsh messages that they were giving to Canadian officials during this whole period, trying to treat us like we could be stepped on, and we had to get in line with them. And we pushed back, and the Canadian government did not cave in. And so, I think they now understand that other countries, especially those that work together with allies and like-minded countries, will not be an easy pushover.
Well, that's the fascinating way of putting it. And do you think that part of the lesson is because this tactic cannot ultimately succeed, that they ought not to try it in the future? I mean, I'm skeptical about this question myself, but I wonder what you think.
Well, in fact, we're hoping that they will not try it as often. When this happened to the Michaels, one of the things that our Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Francois-Philippe Champagne, did was he started a new initiative called the Declaration on Arbitrary Detention and State-to-State Relations. And it's a document that now has signatories of 78 countries and the EU as an organization to hang together and support one another when this happens to one of our citizens in China. And we saw in the trials of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor that the diplomats of many other democratic countries stood shoulder to shoulder, quite literally, with our diplomats outside the courthouse. They weren't our diplomats weren't even allowed in to the courthouse for the trials of our citizens. That's a big abrogation of the Vienna Convention. But we had a lot of company, and that was a really strong message to Beijing that we will work with other countries to work together against policies of China that abrogate rule of law.
So, Ms. McQuaig Johnston, I'm going to veer a little bit, but only a little bit, and I want to talk about this new phrase that that's crept into the geopolitical lexicon, the global South, and China, of course, has assumed an increasingly prominent position as a superpower. The United States has been surprised that some 80% of the world's people are not supportive of the sanctions against Russia for its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And repeatedly, what India and South Africa and Brazil and so on have said is that they do not believe this war is a war, autocracy versus democracy, and it's not in their national interest. They support it. However, at the UN, these countries, the so-called Global South, actually voted against the aggression. It was just the sanctions that they wanted not to support, to show that their national interest wasn't involved. What I want to ask you is, do you think the world is headed to a triumvirate kind of structure where you have the big powers, the superpowers, China and America, but then you have a host of other countries, so-called Global South, which another geopolitical expert has described as a global majority. What do you think about that concept?
Well, I think that's very possible that it may become a triumvirate of that nature. One of the things that China has done very effectively is insinuate their own companies into the economies of many of those countries. And we see that in the presence of Chinese companies, Chinese employees very often, with a big presence in Africa in particular, and increasingly in South America. Now, some of these BRICS and other countries are in fact themselves a form of autocracy, but they will continue, I think, to follow their own independent self-interest. They do have problems of usurious debt that they've been saddled with by some of the China deals that they've struck. And so they're trying to see their way through that process. But India, for example, is an interesting case because they are seeing right on their border with China how aggressive that country has become towards them. China did the same thing with Bhutan, trying to move the boundaries of the country, just to show that China can do that. It's a bully tactic to try to move the borders of another country. You know, China, I think, would be much more effective internationally if it just collaborated with other countries, rather than treating them as tools or as nations on whom they can tromp and show their own bravado. Very often this is for a domestic audience in China. But the tragedy is that India is losing some of its territory by the Chinese using local Tibetans to move into the Indian territory and put up military buildings on Indian territory. And as we saw a few years ago, killing as many as 20 Indians in the process. This is the nature of an aggressor. And so while we all hope to have continuing positive economic relations with China, we also have to be wary of some of its tactics where it comes to, not just India's border, but also overfishing in the Philippines and, taking some of these other tactics in the South China Sea that are really the nature of an aggressor, not a collaborator.
You've been to China a number of times, and you have much better understanding of it than most people. So I want to ask you: do you think that part of what we are seeing is the newness of China becoming a superpower? It's a 5,000-year-old civilization, but in this instant, becoming a major superpower, it's fairly new. And do you think that this is part of growing up to become a stakeholder at that position? How do you categorize that?
Well, my involvement with China goes back to my first visit in 1979, when I was going across the country with a delegation, looking at visiting universities and colleges to see how they were coming out of the Cultural Revolution and what they needed. And a lot of my career in government was spent helping Chinese scientists and engineers and companies develop their own capacity. And they really have relied very heavily on Canadian technologies in their own economic development. And that need is continuing, and they want to continue to access our best researchers in our universities, and transferring to the Chinese military some of those Canadian advances. It's something that is very much an issue on the front burner in Canada right now, how to deal with national security in the context of the Chinese military accessing photonics, artificial intelligence, and other kinds of advanced technologies. That's something that we're trying now to protect ourselves against. While as little as 5 years ago, we were basically offering these technologies. Right. Xi Jinping personally, I think, is the reason behind a lot of this change. When he came to office in 2012, he spent several years consolidating the best technology advances and reworking the governance of science and technology in China, and setting targets for being the most advanced manufacturing country by 2025. They're well on the way to that. Being the most advanced in artificial intelligence by 2030. They're lagging a bit on that target. And then having a target for 2050, being the most advanced economic country in the world. And that's where the U.S. is seeing them as a potential competitor and displacing the U.S. in that regard. And when the Chinese use their target of 2050, what they really mean is 2049, because that will be the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party taking over as the governing force in China. So this is very much a Xi Jinping project. Is China standing up and making its presence known internationally in all these ways, but he sees that as a policy of force, and he doesn't need to do that. As I said earlier, if he could see collaboration, he would get it much more economically advanced and strategically advanced, and he'd be much more successful, frankly, and wouldn't have the U.S. and other countries trying to restrict access to their technologies from China. Now that we see the China he is trying to develop.
So allow me to please take a moment to remind our viewers that PolarisLive.com is a reader-supported channel. To receive news about upcoming programs and to support our work, please visit my website, kashmeri.com, which is KASHMERI.com. Let's go back again to Ms. Margaret McQuade Johnston, who has a lot to talk about Ray Canada and China, and Ray Canada, the United States and China. So I want to ask you, Margaret, that, and I'm tangenting a bit again, there's a lot of criticism in the U.S. the last 2 or 3 days about Prime Minister Modi's visit and the United States trying to cuddle up to India in an ever tighter embrace. Virtually all of the mainstream media, the Times, the newspaper of record, and so on, is saying that the United States needs to be very careful because Mr. Modi has trampled on civil rights, trampled on minorities, Christians and Muslims, and sitting on the sidelines when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, is buying Russian oil, has become now the almost the largest buyer of Russian oil, which it converts into other forms of energy, sells them back to the European Union, and so on. Minorities, I ask, because Canada literally lives on immigration. That it sets the standard, for how a country should grow with immigration. How do you think this will play out? I'm now talking about India, Canada, America, but especially India, Canada. How do you think this will play out in your country?
Well, certainly we have a new Indo-Pacific strategy that was announced a number of months ago. Very strong strategy that positions China as with the negative aspects of it, as well as the potential of trade, and really sets up India and other countries in the region as a way of managing the China risk that many of our companies have experienced. And I've done a lot of work on joint ventures of technology companies in China, and the ways in which they've been taken by their majority Chinese joint venture partners. And one of the reasons I proposed an Indo-Pacific strategy in 2019 was as a way of offsetting or diversifying part of a company's business away from China to other countries in the region that operate by rule of law, which we've seen very clearly that China does not. And with the new elements of regulation that it's placing on companies, especially technology companies, this is only going to get worse. So companies don't have to leave China. They'll want to continue, many of them, in the China market, but they can reduce their risk there by moving some of their business out and some of their manufacturing out to other countries in the region. And India is one of those countries. It's a Commonwealth nation like Canada, and we have many connections at many levels with India. In fact, Indian university students have now surpassed the number of Chinese university students in Canada for the first time. And so this is a great potential for Canada. At the same time, many Canadian companies know that it's sometimes tough to do business in India with all the red tape and over-regulation, and many aspects of doing business in India are difficult with lack of good infrastructure. So there's a lot there that's going to need to be worked on. But I think certainly India's involvement in the Quad is a welcome offset to China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific. And so this is something that Canada is looking at cooperating with India and others on, both the Quad and AUKUS, on the technology front, because their interests in technology are all Canadian technology strengths.
Let me ask you, press you on this one point. If India continues to go down this road of trampling on minorities, changing textbooks, taking actions that that are at the heart of Canada's democracy, do you think that Canada will be as eager to support India if it goes in that direction and becomes more and more an illiberal democracy? What do you think?
Well, I think Canada, along with other like-minded countries, will continue to press points like that in the UN Human Rights Council and in bilateral relations with India. For some, it may cause them to companies or immigration to pull back a bit, but certainly Canada is pretty forthright these days in calling out human rights infringements wherever they are. And India, you're absolutely right, has abrogated the human rights of many of its own citizens. And it's been surprising and very disappointing to see. And so this will continue to be an ongoing discussion with India.
Well, listen, I'd have, before we run out of time, I did want to ask you this question about, China is a huge trading partner of Canada's, I believe, the second largest trading partner after the United States. And China's trade with Canada is growing. How do you think all of this translates into the immigration policy from China, and especially the U.S. China-Canada relations?
Well, we'll continue to have strong immigration from China, and particularly from Hong Kong. This has been a big new trend since the anti-democracy efforts of the Chinese government as it transitions to really making Hong Kong more like a middle-level Chinese city. And many, many people have left and come to Canada, and that trend is going to continue. There's a lot of a concern with what we've seen by recent immigration from mainland China, where there has been effort of the Chinese embassy and consulates to put pressure on Uyghur Canadians, Hong Kong Canadians, Taiwan Canadians, of intimidation and threats, and threats against people's family back home in China, including threats against several Chinese Canadian members of parliament. And one of the things that's being launched in the coming months is a major public inquiry into these developments, as well as China's interference in our last two elections, and trying to fill gaps where the Chinese were busing seniors in to vote with the name of the person to vote for written on their hand, busing in international students with the threat that if they don't vote for a particular person, they'll lose their study visa. Allegations that there has been money provided to pro-Beijing candidates in elections, and students being hired by Chinese Canadian businesses and then assigned to work on the campaigns of pro-Beijing candidates. So these are all things that are being investigated now. There have been leaks from our National Security Agency, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, that brought some of these efforts to light. And this is now going to be a major Canadian inquiry over the coming months, and could last out for a couple of years, as we try to come to grips with the negative forces within our own jurisdiction that China is playing. And the public opinion polls on China since the Michaels were detained, as well as this electoral interference coming to light, has been dramatic. And so China has really changed in the eyes of most Canadians. I was a friend of China for 40 years, and I'm now one of its most outspoken critics because of some of these things that have been happening. And there are many Canadians like me who have just turned tail, will never go back to China, are always critical of China. And this is a transition that Canada is going through in our Canada-China relationship, and is bringing us even more close to the U.S. as a potential partner and like-minded country in dealing with some of these aggressions that we're seeing from China.
Well, as Margaret McQuade Johnston, we have run out of time. So we have to end this conversation. You've been so forthright and so clear, and I really wanted to thank you for joining Polaris Live. I know how busy your schedule is.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure. And with that, let me say goodbye to our global viewership. We hope you will come back again to Polaris Live, especially the next 4 weeks as we finish our third year in operation and get ready for our September launch of the fourth year. So thanking our viewers from around the world. I hope you can join us again. Until then, goodbye.